Hello and welcome to Live Your Language, Tips and Inspiration for Your Bilingual Life. I am Stephanie, a PhD student in second language acquisition and a mother to two children that I'm raising bilingually in my non-native language French. And today we are going to be talking about an issue that really surprises a lot of parents. We try really hard to control our language environment, especially when we're non-native speakers, to make sure that our kids are getting as much minority language input as possible. But then suddenly something happens and the balance of language in the house shifts. I am talking, of course, about siblings. And when we add another child into our home, a lot of people don't realize that over time, that's really going to change the balance of language in their house. This video was inspired by a viewer who has the username of KGax. She wrote to me saying that she has had a lot of success with the Opal method with her oldest child, who's now 4, and she is speaking to that child in Hungarian. And now it turns out that she has a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old is a lot less productive than the 4-year-old was at her age. And she also realizes that the 4-year-old is speaking a lot more English. This worries a lot of parents because of something that's called passive bilingualism or receptive bilingualism, which is where the child understands the language that is being spoken to them, the minority language in this instance, but they respond in the majority language. In this video, we're going to talk all about the effects that siblings have on the language atmosphere in your home and ways that you can kind of combat this. Before I go into these, I just want to mention that when you're looking into the research yourself, make sure that you keep a couple things in mind. So the first is whether the research is taking a look at the majority language or the minority language. A lot of the research I looked at really shed things in a positive light when it was speaking about the majority language and parents using the majority language and siblings being able to kind of teach their younger siblings the majority language. On the other hand, the majority language input that was being introduced by the older child seemed to have a detrimental effect on the minority language use of both children. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is the languages that the parents speak when they're at home. A lot of research found that in homes where the majority language is not spoken inside the home, the minority language skills of the children were a lot stronger, or they seem to resist the contact with the majority language in a way that was not observed in other households where at least one parent spoke the majority language to the children. The last thing to consider is the circumstances under which they came. The reason immigrant status really matters is because when parents are immigrants, there is a higher chance that they have a lower proficiency in the majority language, which means that they are more likely to be dependent on the minority language to speak with their children. Now let's talk about some of the ways that you can help your minority language survive first contact with the majority language and support your kids as they are going into the community and picking up more and more of the majority language. The first piece of advice I have for you is to front load the minority language in your children's lives as much as you can. This will increase the chance of them associating you with that minority language, which is really going to help you weather contact with the majority language further on down the line. I got this really great advice from Adam Beck right when I was starting out. If you haven't heard of him, he runs the Bilingual Monkeys blog and the Bilingual Zoo, which is the associated forum. He is the one who suggested to me that I try as best I can to really establish French, which is our minority language, as my language that I have with my son. And I have really taken that advice to heart, and I think that it has really paid off. Now it really feels strange to speak with my son in a language other than French. The linguist and researcher Dr. François Grosjean talks about this in terms of the person-language bond, which is the way that children and adults associate other people with a language even when those other people speak both languages. They have found that this is especially pronounced in children, and they suspect this might be because it actually facilitates language learning in the way that it allows children to separate the languages more easily. My next piece of advice is for you to really increase the level of minority language input that goes on in your home as much as possible in order to offset the majority language in your home. I know that at the stage where kids start speaking the majority language a lot more, a lot of parents start to feel really helpless, but remember that there is still a lot in your control. For example, TV time, what do they watch? You can choose to only have them watch minority language films and TV shows. Another thing that's in your control is games and books. You can make sure what they do have in the house in terms of recreational activities will really stimulate and encourage the minority language use. If you have a spouse or a partner who speaks the minority language, this might be a really great time to have a conversation with them about switching to the minority language at home method. A de Houwer study showed that this method is actually the most successful in producing a productive or active bilingual with about 97% transmission rate of the language. I recently interviewed Amy of the Our Minority Language Home blog, and she told me all about how, in fact, her family did use a form of Opal before their oldest child started going to school and bringing home the majority language, which for them was French. And at one point, their youngest child really wasn't producing any language at all in the minority language, which was English. So they made a conscious choice to really switch to the minority language at home method, and they have seen really great results. My next tip to you is to make sure that you're monitoring your own language use. Dr. Erika Hoff did a study that found that mothers who had school-aged children ended up speaking a lot more of the majority language to their toddlers when compared to mothers who were speaking to their firstborn toddlers. That is because we have a tendency to respond in the language that we are spoken to. And that goes both ways, which means that if your school-aged children or your toddler speaks to you in the majority language, that a lot of times it's our inclination to respond in that language. But that also means that if you respond in the majority, if you speak to them in the majority language, that they will probably also just keep going with the majority language. That means that it's really important to stick to the minority language even if your child is speaking to you in the majority language. My next piece of advice is to look into Saturday school or heritage language schools or some sort of extracurricular activity that will allow your child to have minority language input. Now, as a corollary to this, I also think that it's worth mentioning that you might want to consider actually starting a program yourself and opening up one of these minority language Saturday school programs for your own community. I mentioned this because this is something that I've really been looking into, and I'm not really sure if I'm going to be able to do it. I really need to start trying to connect with other people in my community. I'm really interested in starting an immersion school in my own community. So I've really been reading up a lot about it and kind of talking to parents in the neighborhood to see if there might be some interest in that. So anyway, I just want to throw that out as something that you could look into. My next tip is to seek opportunities for genuine language use. Kids use and maintain languages when there is a true communicative need. And try as we may fool our kids into believing that we don't understand the majority language for a really long time, but we can't keep that act forever, and eventually they're going to figure it out, usually around this age where they start to use a lot more of the majority language from school or from preschool or wherever they're getting it from. So instead, you really are going to have to eventually find a communicative need for them to use that minority language. That means that you're going to have to find a playmate that doesn't speak English yet or the majority language yet, or you're going to have to try and find an opportunity to travel or welcome a native speaker or maybe grandparents who don't speak the language, the majority language, or a foreign exchange student or somebody that has very limited majority language skills into your home. My next piece of advice is for those who have older children in particular who are using the majority language a lot more at home, and that is to actually have a conversation with them about where they will be expected to use the minority language and why it's important to the family that they do so. And my last piece of advice is to go with the flow and be flexible and understand that while you can control a lot of the things that I've discussed, there are some things that are completely out of your control. For example, the language that they speak between them, that's really something that has to do with their relationship, and it's not something that parents can really dictate. And just remember that if they really continue with the majority language a lot more than you might like, that what you're doing, even if they're receptive or passive bilinguals, is really going to help them in the future if and when they decide that they want to be productive speakers of that language. It's a lot easier for receptive bilinguals to reactivate that language and start using it productively than had they never received that language input at all. So just stick with it, don't switch languages, and let them lead the way in that sense. Okay everyone, that's all I have for you today. I hope you found these tips really useful for promoting productive bilingualism in your children. If you did, please press the like button and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any other videos about bilingual parenting, specifically about bilingual parenting as a non-native speaker. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.